Hi there, in this video I'll be showing you how to create this persistent hover effect in Bricks Builder. This video was inspired by a member of the ACSS community asking about reproducing the effect in this pricing section template in frames. At first sight, there seems to be a selection box that moves depending on which card you hover on. Another interesting feature of this frame is that it is in fact keyboard accessible. So if I were to navigate using the tab key on my keyboard, you'll notice that the interaction also persists, which is great for accessibility. This makes for a delightful interaction that you can use for pricing cards, blog listings, and image galleries. And it's all done with CSS and no JavaScript. The techniques you'll learn in this video will help you to not just create this particular effect, but build your website more efficiently. Also, even though I'll be using Bricks Builder for context, these techniques are based on basic HTML and CSS, which makes them builder agnostic. I'm also assuming you already possess at least intermediate knowledge of CSS. With that said, I'll try to make it as simple as possible so beginners may follow along. Let's get started. Now, let's take a closer look at this effect and see how it really works. So I'll right click here and inspect. So first of all, we see that the cards, these pricing cards, exist inside of a container which has the class pricing grid mic, and that container, the parent container, has a before pseudo element which serves as this moving background, and I'll prove that to you here by changing the background color of this pseudo element, and you can see it's actually a before element. This is the element that moves around the page. But then another interesting thing that's happening is as I hover over the child elements, which are the cards, the before element is also updated, is changed somehow based on what I do with the child element. This is something that wasn't possible in CSS. Generally, what we could do is change or transform a child element based on what's happening to the parent. So for example, you have your blog post cards where you can hover over a blog post card and suddenly the background changes or it moves a bit, the contents move because it's being controlled by the parent. But in this case, it seems that the parent, because the before element is a part of the parent is being affected somehow by what we do to the child element. Now, this brings me to the second important component. So the first important component is the before element, the pseudo element. And the second important component for achieving this effect is the has selector, which you'll find here. I think if you inspect the parent, you see there's a has selector here. So what's the CSS has selector? Well, the has selector is fairly new in CSS. In fact, as at the time of making this video, it currently has a 92.1% support across browsers, which I think is a good number for prime time. The has selector allows us to define CSS selections based on their contents or child elements. So here we are inside of Bricks Builder, and I've built out a dummy page for the sake of our example. And as I scroll down, we have the blog posts section where we would implement that hover effect. We're going to take a few moments to look into the components of this effect and demonstrate how these components might work. So we'll first of all be looking at the has selector, which would demonstrate using these two boxes. So first of all, you'll notice that these two containers exist here with the name example box. They have the exact same class, example box, which means if I were to simply make a selection using the CSS class example box, they will both share the same styles. But then if I needed to define a selection based on the contents of this box, we can have a more accurate selection, because you'll notice though these two boxes have the same class name, they both have different contents. So this one has an SVG icon, while this one has a heading, a paragraph, and an image. And I've also given them appropriate class names as well. So you have example box _heading, double underscore text and double underscore image. Here we have the double underscore SVG. So I'm using the BEM class naming convention, so it's easier to keep track of what we're doing. So let's begin by building out a selection that will select the version of example box that has a child called SVG. We'll do that here. I'll just select one of them, any one of them, and start building out our selection. So here I'm going to type root. If you are pretty new to Bricks, this is a placeholder selector that represents the name of the class in which this custom CSS code is stored. The advantage to having the root placeholder is that it allows us to update the name of the class without breaking whatever custom CSS we have here. So when I go in here and type root, and then I just place my selector test, I usually use a border red solid 4-pixel rule to help us test the accuracy of our selection. Well, so I have root here, and naturally, as you'd expect, it selects both versions of the example box, because all we're saying is select or do this to every instance of example box on the page. Think of them as twins, okay? So both are twin parents, but we want to differentiate them and say the one that has a child named so and so. So we could come here now and say root has, so use the has selector, and I'll use the SVG class. So we could use both, either the HTML tag, or we could use the class. So the class name is example box double underscore SVG in this case, and it will select it as well. If we further broaden the selection, or we change the has content and we say select the version of example box that has a P tag. Notice both of them have a P element, a paragraph element, so it's obviously going to select them both. But let's try that. So if I just include P there, you see it selects them both. Or I could use root double underscore text, and it knows that both of them have a child that has the class name text. The same goes with image. So I'm sure by now you get the picture. It selects the appropriate one based on what you have here. Here's another advantage to using the has selector. Let's just add a background color, okay? What if I need to make a change to this box based on the hover state of a child element? So not just any SVG, but an SVG with a hover state. So I'll just return roots again there, root double underscore SVG, and then give it a hover state. Of course, I can do it with the basic SVG elements, but I just want to use a class here. So use hover, and now it seems to disappear. I'm going to add the background color, as I said, of gray. Now nothing is happening, but the moment the SVG element gets a hover state, the styling activates. So see what happens, which here, as you can see, is really useful and pretty powerful, because previously in CSS without the has selector you couldn't really do this. And here's what I mean. In this place, I have similar thing happening here with this block card, where when I hover anywhere within the boundaries of the block card, two things happen. The color of the title changes and the featured image gets brighter, because these are CSS values that are being updated. So what's happening is, on parent hover, change the styles of some of the child elements. But in this case, what we're doing essentially is, on child hover, change the behavior of the parent in this way. I could even take it another step further, and let's say not just the SVG now, we are going to do that with the P tag or the heading tag. Let's use one of them. When we hover over the text element, change the background color to cyan. Now what happens when I hover over this portion of the code takes effect, but then when I hover over this, the other portion of the code takes effect. And you see how we can literally control the behavior of the parent based on what we do to the child element, and that's pretty powerful. It's one of the things we're taking advantage of in replicating this effect, because then, as I described here, what's happening is what we do to one of the children affects the parent, such that the before element, which belongs to the parent, gets moved one way or the other. Now, one last thing I'm going to show you, which is also an important component of reproducing that effect, is the nth child selector. So what it basically does is that it allows you to select a particular instance of a class as far as its parent is concerned, and I'll explain that, even though again it sounds like a mouthful. Plus, CSS naming conventions can be quite confusing sometimes, so you have to see these things in action. So let's say now I need to select root, just like we did before. I'll just type root and then impute our border. Right, so naturally again I'm just selecting root, but what if I need to select the second instance of root on the page? This is a pretty old CSS tag. You use the nth child selector, so you go nth child and then in bracket you put your formula, the nth value. So in this case I want 2, so it selects the second instance of this class within its parent. So this here is the second child of its parent. Now we will begin building out that effect, the hover effect. Remember, one component of the hover effect is this reddish card here, which, as I said, is a before pseudo element. So let's begin by defining that pseudo element. But before we do that, one very important thing, you notice here I have the blog wrapper, which contains the blog cards, and the blog wrapper is actually a grid, a 3-column grid. As you see, I've defined it here. Now, the first thing we will need to do before we start calculating or building out our before element is to get rid of the gap. This was one of the pitfalls that I had while trying to reverse engineer this effect, was that I had a gap here and it kind of muddled my calculations. I actually got the calculations right, but it just makes the calculations for the movement of that box a bit more complex. So for good measure, just get rid of it. It's going to make your life a lot easier. So first of all, get rid of that, get rid of the gap, and everything looks squished fine. But then we'll compensate for that by selecting the individual card class and adding a padding. So we had, where we had 2 rem there, I'm going to add a 1 rem padding to compensate. Now everything seems to be back to normal. We also have this extra space up there, which should help our selection. In this example, you'll notice there's a real generous padding with the cards themselves to make sure that this border really shines through the background card. But in this case, 1 rem is plenty for us. We'll just use that for now. So remember, in this example, the pseudo element is actually a part of the parent. It's a property, a direct property of the parent, not the card itself. So that's another thing to keep in mind, which means we'll have to go to the parent level, the blog wrapper, and set up our pseudo element. So here I'm going to go root before, and for any pseudo element to be recognized on the page, you need to give it a content. So content, even though it's blank, just give it that. Next, I'll give it a background color so we can begin to see what we are doing. Give it a dark gray, and then we'll define the position of the element. So we'll go position absolute. I'll set the width for now, okay, to, let's see, 30 rem, and the height, I want the height to occupy 100% of the parent, which is the track of that movement. So I'll set that to 100%. And you see it's extending beyond the parent, maybe even further, because the parent is not set to relative just yet. So I have to go fix that. I'll select the blog wrapper and set the main parent to relative. Now when I do that, you notice that problem goes away. So set that to relative. So that's plenty. That's more than enough for what we need to do right now. Now, remember I set the width to something arbitrary, some arbitrary number, it's 30 rem. But we want to do something different. If I set the width to 100%, it takes up the whole width of the parent, which is fine, it's the relative parent. But what we really want to do is to take up a third of 100%, because that whole parent is a grid divided into 3 columns. So we need it to take a third of that. So you could either calculate that yourself or just do it the smarter way and use a calc function. So here I'll go calc 100% to make sure this element takes up a third of 100% of its parent. So that's exactly what we have, and we have a really accurate figure. One more thing I'll need to do, you'll notice it's covering the text here. So we need to somehow shift that before element behind everything else. I'll go -1. And you see it goes so far back that it disappears. But we want to set that table to be the parent also, just like we set the parent to relative. So we'll come back again to the block wrapper layout and set the parent isolation to isolate. And so we have our before element right behind everything, and we can be sure it's not going to intersect or overlap with anything else. It's always going to be behind. The next thing we have to do now is to make it move. Now that we've set up our before element, we can now proceed to animate it based on what we have. And remember the principle I shared here, that you can actually change a parent based on what you do to the child. So I'll need you to pay close attention as we build out this selection. Naturally, I'll go to the block wrapper root, and then I'll just drop my border selector there so we can begin to see what happens as we build out the selection. So the next thing I'll do is root that has, remember the class names of the child is block card. So root has block card. So the block card. I also want this selection to work for the before, not just the block card. Okay, so I have to come over here and add before, and now it selects the before, which means now we are having a good selection of the before. What we want to do is affect the before based on the hover state of the child. So far we've been able to target the before pseudo element. We now need to set up the hover state. So here, instead of just block card, I'll do hover, and now it disappears because it's waiting for the block card to be in hover state. At this moment, without the hover state, it doesn't qualify to inherit this property. Now, when I hover over any instance of the block cards, you'll notice this rule takes effect. One more thing I want to do is, I want this effect to happen only when I hover over specific boxes, not just any one of them, because right now, block card hover covers all three of them. And you guessed it, this is where the nth selector comes in. So now I can come here and say block card nth child 2 for this example. Now if I were to go nth child 2, what we're basically saying is when the second instance of block card gets a hover state, do this to the before of the parent. So now when I hover over the first and the third one, nothing happens. But watch what happens when I hover on the second one. So we know that our selector is working. If I set this to 1, it happens only when I hover on this one. We need to define the movement now. So what I want now is to move this to the second position when I hover on the second card. So let's set this back to 2 and get rid of this border. What we'll be using is the translate property in CSS. Now translate was initially a part of the transform property, but recent iterations of CSS now support the direct property itself. So translate and so on, they all exist as a property. Things like translate scale, they can exist on their own. So we have translate set to 0 and 0. Okay, now these two values are x and y values. That's what the translate property takes. So here I wanted to move a distance towards the right. Now what distance would that be? Remember, we have 100% broken into 3 places to give us this grid, and also it's what gave us the width of this before element. So if this current position is 0, by moving this 100%, we'll move it effectively to the middle. So that's what we'll do. We'll use the translate property and set the x-axis to 100%. Now watch what happens when I hover on the second element. You see that the before element moves, but it just seems like it appears in place. It doesn't look like there's a movement, but there is indeed a movement. The only thing now that we need to do is to add a transition property to the element itself. So you go to the main before element and add a transition property. So we'll go transition, and you see how it moves smoothly across the track. So we'll repeat this again and get it to work for the third card. So I'll just duplicate this line of code. and then I'll set the nth child instead to 3. So when I hover over the third one, move it, but it's not moving far enough, so I'll change that now to 200%. So when I do that, it travels the whole way, and at this point you can tell we already have the makings of that whole snippet up here. But remember, we still need to have the focus element, the keyboard focus behavior for keyboard accessibility. I'm also going to take this code one more step. So before we add keyboard accessibility, let's do one more thing. What if I want something more, so that this effect, this background, only appears when I hover, not when my mouse is out? Because here it feels like this. Now it works just fine if you maybe need to highlight a pricing card like what we had here. We could modify this code so that the middle pricing card which is a recommended pricing card, is always highlighted, so everything moves from there instead. So in this case, if we, for example, have these as our pricing cards and we want this to be highlighted as the recommended pricing option, you could do that just as easily by coming into the code here. So I'll add a translate property and I'll set that to 100% by default. So whatever you put here, it's going to be the default state of this card behavior. But that means we have to define the first card as well. So let's define the positioning for the first card and just set that back to 0. Now, when I hover over the first one, it moves there accordingly. So that's one way you could do it if you're using this for a pricing card and you'd like to highlight one of them. But then let's take this a step further and just return everything to 0. What if I want to change this such that the that highlight effect, that card doesn't appear unless I hover over one of these items? So I want my cards to be clean, and then when I hover, then the box goes into action. We can do that by adding one more property named opacity, and then I'll set the opacity by default to 0. Now when I hover here, I want to change the opacity to 1. Just copy that line of code and duplicate that across the board. Now watch what happens when I hover. You see that the animation, the card shows up when I hover over any of the cards, and then it goes away when I take my mouse out. So there's a lot of fun and interesting things you could do with this snippet of code. We'll just view this on the front end. And now we have our card working. One more thing I just noticed is I don't have that border radius, so we'll just quickly add a border radius there. Great. So now you see how it behaves. One more thing that we can do is make it keyboard accessible. At the moment, when I tab around the page, you see that as I select these items, nothing happens. That selection is not there. So it means we need to update the code to cater for keyboard navigators. How do we do that? Well, we'll simply copy this. Just come here, copy this. I'm going to add a comma here. Basically, the comma in CSS is kind of a way of adding an or statement. So for this or this, do this. So have that there. But we're going to update this portion of the code here, the hover, and we'll change that to focus within. So what it basically tells the browser is if the user hovers over the element, or if their keyboard focus falls on this element, then run this code, do this style. So I'll just do that across the board and add the focus within option as well. Great. So now I've saved it, and on the front end you'll notice something. When I use my keyboard to navigate now, you see it follows along. Not sure why that happened. Might be my mouse. Okay, so there's something wrong. Obviously, I forgot to update the value here to 3. So always keep that in mind when working on this. So now when I navigate with my keyboard, I should have the right position for the before element. Now, this has been one of the more creative ways to use the has selector to our advantage. Feel free to post in the comments if you have any questions or need clarification. And If you found this tutorial helpful, I'll encourage you to click the subscribe button so you don't miss out on more nifty tutorials that I have planned. You can also go the extra mile by using the link in the description to buy me a coffee or 3 if you've found this video valuable. Till I see you in the next one, stay nifty. Thanks for watching.